Welcome to our first fall semester 2020 Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, our program on reimagining public safety, equity, justice, and anti-racism. We're meeting August 27th, 2020. Tomorrow is the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and tomorrow is also going to be March on Washington 2020, which is a march for criminal justice reform against police brutality in the United States. We're also meeting, of course, in the wake of George Floyd and the protests that have occurred since May 25th of this year in the aftermath of George Floyd's public execution by the Minneapolis Police Department. That sparked over 4,700 national demonstrations for Black Lives Matter, with 20 million people participating, and also global demonstrations in Munich and London and Oxford and other parts of the world. Unfortunately, we are also meeting less than a week after the Jacob Blake police shooting in Kenosha, Wisconsin. This is really tragic. I think Doc Rivers, who's the coach of the Los Angeles Clippers, said it very well when he said that he was tired, he was exhausted with loving a country that doesn't love it, that doesn't love us back, talking about the Black community, the love for America, and all the violence and the hatred that we've seen historically, but contemporaneously. Jacob Blake seemingly is going to be paralyzed from the waist down, but our prayers go out to him and his family and support for him and his family. One thing we have to always remember, these are real people who are being shot and killed. These are people who we have to have deep empathy for and love for and relate to their children, the people who they care for, their family, their spouses, their loved ones who don't deserve any of this that's happening to them. Also, our prayers are out to the people who were injured and also killed by a white supremacist in Kenosha, Wisconsin on Tuesday night, who's 17 years old, who apparently is a supporter of the President of the United States and this idea of MAGA, and who came with a semi-automatic weapon in the streets and killed and has been charged with first-degree murder in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And certainly we want to acknowledge the NBA players who, Milwaukee Bucks players who sat out and went on strike, a work stoppage in defense of Black lives. And playoff games weren't played in the NBA. There were discussions of whether or not the NBA season would continue. Apparently that season's going to continue. Major League Baseball postponed games. The WNBA postponed games and came out very, very much in defense of Jacob Blake. And these Black women who are part of the WNBA have been leaders in this fight in terms of sports, way ahead of their male counterparts in terms of defending Black people and Black lives. So with that being said, my name is Peniel Joseph, and I'm the Barbara Jordan Chair in Political Values and Ethics and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy and professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin. We've been in this space of anti-racism this is our 6th year now, and we've had this opportunity to share and to organize, and this is another one of these events. And I'm really pleased to have 3 very, very important activists and intellectuals and change makers with us today. We have Sukyi McMahon, who's the strategic director of the Austin Justice Coalition with us. We have Kellee Coleman, who works with the city's Office of Equity with us. And we have Chris Harris, who's the director of the Criminal Justice Project at Texas Appleseed. And these are 3 change makers right here in Austin. When we organized this event, we could not have known of the latest round of tragedies that would happen. But the reason why we wanted to organize this event is because we wanted to deal with people and activists in Austin who are trying to impact social policy vis-a-vis the criminal justice system. And we also wanted to disaggregate, because one of the things that's happening right now is there's a lot of fear being spread about defund the police. There's a lot of fear being spread about reimagining public safety. There's a lot of fear and violence being spread from the highest corridors of power in the United States right now. And we want, because we're so interested in democracy, small d democracy, we're so interested in citizenship, active citizenship, and anti-racism. We wanted to bring together this trio of activists who are on the ground, who have long track records, who understand the policy side of this, the politics, but who also understand the human value behind the Black folks, and at times white allies and Latinx allies and allies of color who are being injured and harassed and surveilled by law enforcement, at times killed by law enforcement and vigilante violence. And then finally, we want to know, what can we do about it? We're here together to say, what can we do about it? Because this is something that is ongoing. It's a generational struggle to end this kind of racism and this kind of brutality that is a central feature of American democracy. That is unfortunate, but it's factually correct. What happened in Kenosha, what's happened to George Floyd, these are not aberrations. These are a central feature of our democracy. And the challenge for us is to transform that situation, to transform that reality. So I'll start with Sukyi McMahon of the Austin Justice Coalition. I want to have a discussion with you, Sukyi, and the panelists are all going to talk for 5 to 10 minutes at the start, and then we're going to get into a conversation, and then we're going to also answer questions. I want to talk to you about reimagining public safety, but the language that's been used nationally by both proponents of and critics of is this idea of defund the police. And I want to separate fact from fiction. And my first question to you is really, what does defund the police actually mean? And how is that connected to reimagining public safety? And then with what the city of Austin just recently, the city council passed, what aspect of the new investments that the city council has passed and sort of budget reallocations are connected to reimagining public safety? And certainly the Austin Justice Coalition has been at the forefront of this fight right here locally in Austin.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here and to be a part of this conversation, especially with my amazing colleagues, Kellee and Chris. We've all been working in the advocacy policy realm for a while. And I think this is a wonderful group that I enjoy being a part of. And I want to thank you for, helping us to bridge the gap between the academy and advocacy. I think that it's not a big leap, and I'm glad that we're here to talk about this. So this notion of defund, you probably won't find two advocates who would have the same definition. But in my mind, this is really taking a look at how much we put into policing and why we put that much money into policing. In Austin, the public safety budget, especially towards policing, is the lion's share of our budget for decades. And so we have kind of put that under a microscope and, looked at the things that we're calling police out for, and all the things that get a response from a person with a gun that probably do not need that kind of response, and often results in some kind of a harm that's unnecessary, that could be handled differently by different people with different tactics to get a different outcome. So this idea of defunding for me means reducing the amount of purview the police has by really looking at what we need police for. And all the reasons that we don't need police, we put a lot of responsibility in their hands. And I think that what's happened here in Austin is that, our council has really started to look at all the different ways that policing, some of their tactics are even outdated or unnecessary. Take, for instance, the mounted patrol. If you look back, way back in policing history, mounted patrol, you think of like the small town with the one sheriff on the back of a horse. The fact that we have mounted patrol today is just romanticism and nostalgia. It's unnecessary. Policing tactics have changed a lot, and that's just an unnecessary cost. And things like that can be just totally removed, and those funds, millions and millions of dollars, that can be then rerouted into alternatives to public safety, like violence prevention. We're talking about an Office of Violence Prevention here, and mental health first responders, so that it's not police knocking on the home of someone who's in crisis, but we're responding to a medical problem with a medical response. So these are the ideas that we are thinking of, that the City Council has proposed and unanimously voted to support, and that at least my group supports. Our initial proposal was 100 million, and this was along with our coalition members, Chris Harris being a part of that, and a few other organizations. At a minimum, we said, shoot for that and then do more. But here's exactly a budget. Here are the line items you should be looking at. Here's how to make this happen. And we gave them something to circle around and to really kind of peel and to see what was possible. So that's kind of where we started. And they ended up at 150 million. 20 million of which is immediate cuts, not having cadet classes over the next year. And I think about that and think, every year we've had cadet classes, but if we don't have cadet classes for 1 year, all the things that we can get for that, we have a big police force. We had a lot of openings that were not going to be filled already. So the idea that we could cancel these classes and then get, more ambulances. There are days when you call in for an ambulance and there just isn't one. Right now in Austin, that's happening, and so EMS said, can we get some more ambulances? And that seemed like a very reasonable response for this time. Rather than more police, how about more ambulances? So that's kind of the idea there. And so, yeah, we've been in support of that immediate 20 million. And then there's a task force that's looking at areas to decouple from policing. So for instance, our forensics lab, should that not be run by scientists? That seems like a reasonable thing. Our 911 call center, that could also not be run by police, because often that's why we have such a huge police response. If you're calling into the 911 call center and it's APD who picks up and then routes the calls, a lot of those calls don't go to to fire or to EMS. So we are, pitching that maybe we would get better outcomes if that's taken out of the responsibility of APD. It doesn't need to be run by them. So Chris Harris and others are involved in this task force in reimagining justice here in Austin. And that's kind of their charge, is to look at these items and to create a plan for that. I'm sure that he can speak at length on that topic. But I don't think it's something to be afraid of. I think that it's something we can all lean into in this moment, because can we keep doing what we have been doing? Do y'all want to keep doing what we've been doing? Do you want, men who are, working on their girlfriend's cars, being shot by police? Because that's what happened to Mike Ramos, who was unarmed. Do you want naked Black boys running in the street who are clearly in crisis being shot down within 30 seconds of a police interaction? Do we want more of that? I don't think that right now anyone has a taste for that anymore. I feel like we're in this moment, in this movement, and I feel that if we can all lean into the uncertainty of building equity rather than the certainty of continued racism, that trajectory will put us on a different path. And I think that on the far side of this, if we succeed, then we can look back at this moment and say, we made sure that everyone was accounted for in this moment, and we did a damn good job. That's what I hope. I hope that we look back at this historic moment and know that we were careful. We didn't replicate systems that have been harmful. And at the core of new policies, new structures was human dignity. That any decision, any choice, any action that's made, we can always ask as a principle, as an organizing principle, was anyone's dignity diminished in that moment? When you roll up on someone and you scream at them and you treat them a certain way, that should be the barometer of, this was a bad interaction. This is what we can't do anymore. Anyways, I've talked enough. I hope that answered your question about defunding and the misinformation. And we certainly need to be strategizing around um, combating that misinformation, because it's easy to stoke fear um, rather than to move forward into something new.
Thank you, Sukyi. Yes, that answers for the first round. I'm going to come back to you with fear and all of it for you, and talk about what do we mean by safety too. Kellee,
Hi.
I'd love for you to really talk about how you're feeling about this moment, and really uh, both you in this space, but obviously we have an equity office in the city that's trying to push the needle and do some positive things, but there's also a gap between what organizers and grassroots activists will want and what a city feels that it can do. So how are you feeling about what the city council has just passed, and just where we're at in the city of Austin vis-a-vis public safety?
Sure. So just a little bit about me for context, y'all. My name's Kellee Coleman. I'm from a neighborhood in Austin called Dove Springs. Daniel Rocha was killed behind my house years ago. I knew Javier Ambler. I also knew Mikey Ramos. And so I'm a parent, as you can see. Um, and I take this work very seriously. And I have a community that I'm accountable to. So I'm not just a bureaucrat in a city system that's sort of unwieldy, right? I'm rooted in a different way. And I really think that there have been folks that have been pushing on the city for the last 5-6 years to divest, invest, right? So it's not just this idea of pulling money from APD without a thought process around where that money needs to go, right? Where we're lacking, and why those systems aren't stabilized to do what we need them to do, and why APD is getting majority of the funding, right? And so there are folks that have been thinking about this for years. And I think that when the equity office was created, it was created out of organizing, right? Folks in the community were just done. Because as Chris will tell you with the data, outcomes, the most reliable indicator for a quality of life outcome is race, right? And so in a city that was deemed the best place to live in the country several times, is there a correlation between Black folks leaving, right, and these negative outcomes for Black people and other people of color, to it being the best place to live in the country, right? Like, what's that about? How can those two things exist at the same time? And I think that thinking about some of the work that Dr. Tang did back in a few years ago, not feeling welcome was one of the top 3 reasons folks left, right? And that's connected to their experiences with policing. And so I think that the city has gotten the message that people are done with police violence. And professionally, my relationships in the city with APD, we've been trying as an equity office to push on them as well. And there are some folks that are more receptive than others, right? We've done an assessment that we're still working on, and all this stuff ended up happening right in the middle of that, right? And so I think now more than ever is an opportunity to not just defund the police, but reimagine the world we want to live in, the world we want to be a part of. And I think you mentioned it, when you introduced me is, you know, the gap to go, right? We have these beautiful sort of visions and missions, but what is the reality, right? And in between those two, that's the work. And I think for our office, and I'm so grateful to even be invited to a conversation like this. Thank you so much. I didn't say that, but I appreciate even being able to be in this space and share what I've learned. Um, but I've only been able to learn that because there are folks who have been doing this forever, and the equity office is really trying to follow the leadership of the community. And when I say that, I don't mean everybody. I mean people most directly impacted by inequities, right? The folks who this is their day-to-day experience, um, and trying to really hold strong in that. We don't rubber stamp things in our office, and I'm grateful for that. We are also a part of the task force that Sukyi mentioned. We're also a part of, there's a video review panel that the city is looking at the police academies training and the videos that they watch. There's the Resolution 66 that has several components of investigation into the police. And I think even right now actually today, I think Brian and other executives are looking over proposals for that. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's an opportunity to do right, to make things right. The only way that we can is if we stop the abusiveness, right? Like when you're in an interpersonal abusive relationship, you can't heal if your abuser is still in the house abusing you, right? Like they have to go, and there has to be redress, and there has to be some time, there has to be acknowledgement. And I don't think that we've fully gotten through the steps, but there's an opportunity to, and I just hope that the city ends up doing what's right by our communities.
Great. Thank you so much, Kellee. It's an honor for us to have you here. So thank you. Thank you. Chris, you've been working on this, and everybody cites you as our data guru as well on what negative outcomes are in Austin and strategies for positive outcomes. So want to put the mic in your hand in terms of what do you think has been done, especially since May 25th? What are we trying to do? What should we collectively be trying to do as all citizens, irrespective of color, background, partisanship, ideology, because we all should want a safe Austin that doesn't discriminate and segregate and kill one community because of their skin color or their background or their poverty. What should we be doing, especially in light of what's happening nationally now with Wisconsin? Again, like I asked Sukyi and Kellee, one of the things I've seen just as a citizen and a scholar is all the fear mongering happening right now around this idea of reimagining public safety to make Black communities safer. There's this fear that there's going to be chaos if we live longer.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for the question and for the opportunity to address you all and be in this amazing panel. Gosh, that's a big question. So I work for Texas Appleseed, and you know the focus of our organization has long been around, especially within the criminal justice realm, it's been around issues of poverty. So fighting things like debtors' prisons, whereby people are literally put into jail by virtue of their inability to pay fines and fees, right? The actual assessment of those fines and fees, often without taking into account people's ability to pay, unfair bail practices, and really cash bail itself as a system, which allows for people to be jailed by virtue of their inability to pay a bail. And really looking at the different ways that the system really goes above and beyond in punishing people in poverty in particular. And, I think that what I'm hopeful to bring and have tried to help start bringing to our organization an additional component, which is looking at the policing side of it, which is the front end of this system, which in addition to carrying out the jailing, the incarceration, and the interactions that lead to violence on the basis of this poverty, right? On the basis of people being unable to pay the fines and fees assessed by this system, right? It also is the front end of a system of control, right? I often point to the stat of the number of folks brought up on charges, both in Austin, but if you look around the state, it's between 2/3 and 3/4 in almost every place that qualify for indigent defense, meaning that they are indigent in the eyes of that local community. So the people that are actually accused of crimes in communities across the state are overwhelmingly in poverty, right? And so the definition of indigence will vary from location to location, but in Austin, what it means is that you make within 20% of the federal poverty line. And so for a single individual, that's a little over $15,000 a year. And so that's the max that someone would be making in order to qualify for indigent defense. If they were in a family of 4, it'd be about $30,000 a year as a max. So this is who the system is bringing in. This is what the system is designed to do. And clearly we have a whole host of additional systems, right, that our organization also has programs designed to help address, but that are also ensuring that Black people are overwhelmingly and disparately in poverty, subjected to this system. And so, I think as it relates to, all of these topics, I think one of the central pieces that we have to keep in mind is that we have to address poverty in our communities. And I think divestment, reinvestment, defund, whatever you want to call it, the central component of it is actually the reinvestment piece. The reinvestment piece to actually address these inequities, to pull people out of poverty, right? That is actually driving a lot of the interactions with these systems. Again, systems designed to pull people in due to their poverty. So for us, obviously we want these systems to treat people who are currently in poverty more fairly. We want them to take into account their poverty, not subject them to not just incarceration or additional fines and fees or having their driver's licenses taken away, but also we want to reduce their being subjected to police interactions themselves, because those interactions then also cause more poverty. When you are being pulled over disproportionately by police, which Black people are, brown people are, in almost every community across this country, that means you are assessed more fines, more fees. When you cannot show up because you have kids, you have a job, you have your driver's license suspended, so you miss court dates, those fees escalate. And soon you're in a cycle of debt where now you can't drive, you're completely subjected to the whims of the state, as are your children, any other dependents, your healthcare, all of it. So, I think, where we really are focused is in, again, not only just ensuring that the systems today as they are attempt to treat people who are poor and again, who are disproportionately Black and brown more fairly, but we have to ensure that that we're taking money away from these systems that are doing this and putting it into programs and opportunities that actually lift people out of poverty. The last thing I'll say is that, I think burgeoning research is really showing the extent to which, and I think, obviously there's a long tradition of scholars, radicals, academics, everyone talking about the links between policing, slavery, slave patrols, and really how it's designed to continue and perpetuate a system of control. And again, there's a lot of burgeoning research that supports that police continue to do this, particularly at a neighborhood level, in that a lot of what they are doing is actually designed to keep certain people out of certain neighborhoods. And that's really what's going on. Not necessarily that they are fighting crime equally across the city, and it just so happens that they are pulling in certain types of folks. It's that they're actually targeting certain places with the sole purpose of trying to keep certain people out of certain places. And so what we have to do is to say, well, how can we ensure that, one, the system doesn't see anybody as undesirable by the virtue of their race. And if we deem that a certain class is undesirable, how do we actually ensure that we are helping to alleviate people from being in this class? How do we actually lift people out of poverty and give them the resources to succeed? And in fact, this is going to address a lot of what the system refers to today as crime, and what many in the activist community really want to focus on, which is harm. And so, I think these are the areas we need to go in. We need to continue to look for opportunities to reduce these systems that are treating us unfairly. We need to ensure that that money is reinvested in programs and community-based alternatives that actually support folks and help lift people out of poverty and give people real opportunities and freedom. And we need to be really checking all of our tendencies to control who is where and why, and on what basis, because I think that this mindset runs deep within our country and everyone who lives in it and is raised in it.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. I'm going to do another round with all of you, Austin-based, and then we're going to go national. Based on what Chris and Kellee have said, and Sukyi, you said earlier, I want to ask you, Sukyi, about, because since May 25th, and I think we're heading for a new round with the NBA work stoppage and what's happening in Kenosha, there's been so many people, especially white allies, corporate elected officials, ordinary citizens, people of color as well, but who say, what can we do? What can we do? Including, we have over 200 people on this webinar, and many of them are, I would assume most of them are just of goodwill and just want to be active citizens, deeply empathetic. What can we do? Certainly, I'd say support Austin Justice Coalition and support Texas Appleseed, support the work we're doing here at the university as well. But what can, Sukyi, specifically, because, AJC had this $100 million minimum. What could be done? Because sometimes people ask me too, well, what can we do? And I know you all are deep in terms of the policy, ideally, not a politics of pragmatism, but a politics of audacious freedom dreams. What can be done? What can the city of Austin, including the tech community? I've been on so many calls with C-suite leaders, including business leadership, including faith leaders, right? Including just ordinary citizens who are right here on this call, people who want to teach their kids that what happened in Kenosha is bad, Black Lives Matter, American democracy counts for something in the world. I want to start with you, Sukyi. What can we do that especially goes beyond what the city council did? There are no magic bullets, but that would really have massive social impact right here in Austin.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that what's happening here in the criminal justice system with policing, it's porous. It impacts healthcare and housing and employment and education. And there's not a system that anyone who's watching isn't involved in that. They're all working together. And I think that there are multiple parallel tracks for change, sure, we've got this whole thing going with the criminal justice track, but, as we start to look at, pushing over some of these responses into the social work sphere, instead of having police respond to mental health calls, we're having social workers respond, how are they reckoning with racism in that field to make sure, again, that we're not replicating the same differentiation and harm that policing has. And then the same for the education system. When you have people who are educated, and the more people learn about their own oppression, the more they can voice that and the distaste for that, so there are all of these things that have to happen all at once, towards the same end. And regardless of your race, I think that we can all recognize that we'll all benefit when, there's equity in all of these systems. So I think it's important to, understand that the money that we pull out of policing it's important for folks who are watching to think about how their systems can be improved by that, especially with the lens towards racial equity and racial justice. Um, for white folks who are wanting to become involved, with AJC, I always ask folks who ask what they can do. I ask, well, what are you good at? And how can you apply that to this work? I think that's really important to recognize that the work that I'm doing because I actually really enjoy policy work and I like writing about these things and educating people about those things. I stepped into this because this is what I'm good at, and I knew that it was to a certain end, a goal that I valued, and some people are artists or whatever their craft or skill is, and I always ask them to just bring that, like bring your best self, and then you won't feel that this is a stretch, like honestly, advocacy doesn't have to be outside of your wheelhouse. It is exactly what you make of it often. So I think it's a time for transformative thinking for ourselves internally. Like, how can I do advocacy work the best way that I know how? Just because AJC needs someone who does coding doesn't mean that you yourself have to go and pick up a book and learn like coding for dummies and then try to apply that. We don't need that. We need you to bring your best selves to this work. And yeah, we'll also take your money because we need staffing and all those things to increase our bandwidth. But it's your treasure, it's your time, it's your talent, it's the 3 T's, that you can put into this work. But whatever you bring, make sure that it's not causing more harm or more work, especially on the Black folks who are leading in these ways. I also would say that I would love to see what the proposal would be from the white community in terms of dismantling racism. I don't see that a lot. I support Black Lives Matter, but I don't see the 5 key things that the white community is going to work on for themselves to dismantle racism. I appreciate the support, but I think about school shooters, and I'm just going to say it. I think about school shooters. We know the demographic of school shooters are usually white boys who are teenagers who have gone through a certain trauma in their schools. And if we were to even address that, like full on, like the white community is like, we can't have this anymore. These are our kids, and then we're asking their teachers to carry guns and to shoot those students who are their own students. Like, it's crazy. And if we don't want to continue doing that, like in your 5-part plan, number 1, how do we end school shootings forever? How do we make sure that doesn't happen? What are we going to teach our kids about racism and entitlement and privilege and bullying and all of the things, patriarchy? Like, how do you address that? And it's a really good starting point, honestly. But that's something I would be interested to see, honestly. But yeah, there's a lot of work to do within that group, and then just thinking about how you can best bring yourselves into groups that you aren't leading, to ensure that you aren't co-opting, that you're listening. If you want to be coming to a Black space and learn about these issues from our point of view, there's a lot of listening and a lot of learning that you have to do on the front end. And I've always appreciated folks that do that, just come to learn for a while and take it in and then apply it out in the world.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Sukyi. Kellee, I'm going to ask you really the same thing in terms of what are some policies, what should the city be doing? What can people who want to volunteer, who are just right here on the call, what should we be working towards?
I think that we should be all trying to sort of work ourselves out of a job, right? I'm trying to work myself out of a job at the equity office. We shouldn't have to be there, right? I'm with Sukyi. If we sending in social workers, I'm gonna need them to have an anti-racist analysis. Otherwise, they'll continue like we have now, some of the worst outcomes in Travis County. Well, I think we have the worst outcomes in the state, county, our county does, around removals of Black children and now Latino children. And so in the top 3 reporters are healthcare institutions, schools, and there's one other one I can't think of. But it's one of those things, right? Where all of these institutions were built by and for white folks, white men specifically, and everyone else had to sort of fight and claw their way in there, right? And so no wonder we're having terrible outcomes when it comes to all of these systems. And like Sukyi said, they don't work alone. It's like Paulo Rojas calls it the braid of oppression, right? They work together. And so we have to sort of undo that and have an understanding first. I think there's so much work, right? But we need anti-racist teachers. We need anti-racist nurses. We need folks who bring this analysis into their day-to-day work every single day, right? Folks that work at Parks and Rec, people who are out doing for our city, like the street and drainage work, right? We work with folks in our watershed department who's impacted by floods. My family lost everything in the 2013 floods in Dove Springs, right? Who was impacted by that, right? Negatively. I mean, we can go on and on, but it's important. That's one thing I think that our office has tried to work on is really developing folks to have an understanding around the history. We always start with history. I think Chris was talking about, how policing is really rooted in the slave patrols, but it's also rooted in the notion of private property, right? And folks, we don't talk about that piece very often. I think it's just really asking folks to start from themselves and sort of like in the popular education way, right? Like start from within and then you work your way out, and it's just praxis, because we don't have the answers. We're here trying to crack our heads and hearts open together to really have the wherewithal to imagine, because we've been so traumatized from all of this, right? So boxed in. It's really hard to imagine ourselves. What does it look like when we've achieved equity, right? What does it look like when we've created the world that we want to live in? Will we know it when we see it? Those are, to me, the ways that people can engage this work. It has to be from connecting the head and the heart. It can't just be from this intellectual space, which I feel like a lot of people try to do. I feel like specifically to my white folks, my white brothers and sisters have to have skin in the game. And I think we saw it when George Floyd was killed and people showed up like that was their child, right? That's where we need to be. Because every time I see it, it's my child, it's my brother, it's my sister, right? That's how it needs to be. And I think whenever we can we start building out from there, it'll make the folks who are in these systems intentionally causing harm so uncomfortable that they just move around, right? And I think it's on us to hold our people accountable. We think we get so confused around representation. Oh, we got this person of color in this in this seat, or they're doing this, and that's a piece. But I think it's not enough. We need folks who have an analysis and who are doing right by our communities. Otherwise, they just perpetuating white supremacy and smiling in our faces and one of us, right? And so, and I think the way that we do that is by building relationships and being honest and forthright. And people get uncomfortable with that, right? Because that ain't how politics is played, but that's what we need. It shouldn't have to be this hard. I think. And I think that as we do more of this, and this is just a little piece of it, right? This is going to take a while. Folks been working on this for a long time, and this is going to be life's work, I think. So if you're going to commit to it, then we welcome folks who are willing to learn, who want to sharpen their analysis and get right. We're here.
Thank you, Kellee. I hope Chris can tell us what it looks like. I hope we could recognize what it looks like in terms of the new world. Some of that's connected to outcomes, Chris, and you were talking about that. Again, policy-wise, what could we do? But I'm thinking more than just policy. I'm really thinking as a community, Austin, because it's like what Kellee was saying. I remember when I moved here 5 years ago, you know, keep Austin weird, and it was, you know, always in the top 5 of best places to live. And then when you come and you're Black, you see the Black experience here is going to be different. It's going to be different. So what could we do in terms of a all hands on deck approach, not just to anti-racism, but racial equity, racial justice, economic equity right here? And then how would that look?
Well, I would say anyone who says they have all the answers to that is lying to you first. So I won't pretend to do that. I would say, my general, thought process around these issues is that, the federal government is for resources. Ultimately, there's different economic theories, but they have an ability to print money and to spend beyond their means. So we need universal programs from the federal government that help fund the things that we want to see on the ground to the maximum extent possible. Things like universal healthcare, things like universal college, things like universal pre-K that really expand and extend to every single person, regardless of race or class or gender or whatever, certain inalienable resources and opportunities in our country. Then at the state level is where you have the laws generally mostly controlled. Obviously, the federal government makes laws as well. But when we're talking about the criminal codes and statutes and a lot of your environmental regulations and all that sort of stuff, it's largely controlled at the state level. And so, we need work at the state level to ensure that, we are getting rid of laws that are unfairly targeting people based on their race, their class, their gender, their sexual orientation. Of which many still exist on the books today. And in fact, if you really look at it, a lot of laws are designed specifically for that purpose, and which is why so many of us in the activist community don't even talk about crime because, or are beginning to really eschew talking about crime, because what is a crime? It's something designed to criminalize and to punish certain behaviors, but on what basis? And we see that for many of them, it's on the basis of attacking certain communities unfairly. And then at the local level, we also have a lot of both laws and resources at our disposal. Now, obviously, the local government is going to have to balance its books. It can't spend beyond its means like the feds. So there's a limited pool of money. And this is partly what informs the divestment work from these criminal justice systems, because what we also see at the local level is about 2/3 of the criminal justice system, even though they're not writing most of the laws at the local level, that's where the money goes. This is where your police are. This is where your sheriff is. This is where your jail is. This is where all your courts are at the city and at the county. And so what we really need to be doing is to say, okay, we have a limited pool of resources here within our city and our county, coming from our local tax dollars almost solely. And if you look at Austin, we're talking about $430+ million in the police department. We're talking about another almost $200 million in the sheriff, in the jail. We're talking about another, $30-40 million in the district and criminal attorney offices, the prosecutor's offices. Then we have, the criminal defense and the public defender, which are necessary in order to obviously give folks a chance, especially poor people who opt into these systems, but that's additional monies as well. Then you have all the judges, the judiciaries. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, going upwards of $1 billion siphoned from this community every year into purely the goal of punishment, right, of people. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, can we actually address the things that we are punishing people for today better by actually funding things that provide people with the resources that help people, one, avoid behaviors that we all agree are bad, but also by ensuring that people's needs are met and that we don't have systems that are actually intentionally out here targeting people on the basis of, again, their race, their class, their gender, what have you. So it's really about getting into your local budgets, city and county level. Now, right now, those debates are happening for the next year and are largely done. But it's never too soon to be thinking about the next year's budget and how we can really be looking at, okay, how can we address the issues that are legitimate, that these systems are addressing today better? When we talk about police, we know we have people in mental health crisis in this community. How can we get people who are not going to harm folks, who are not going to arrest people or target people on the basis of race or class, but who are going to help people in a mental health crisis, which we know that we need. And then how can we also take some of the funds that are going towards these systems today, and again, put them into programs that are actually going to, again, support people's needs, housing, public health, and really, again, lifting folks up out of poverty. These are the things that we, I think we really need to do. And I think, I think, dreaming about what that looks like is something we should be done in collective and in organization. And so for as far how people can get involved, I would say if there's a local organization, it's AJC or Communities of Color United, grassroots leadership, Undoing White Supremacy, Austin, DSA, whomever it is, if there's an organization today that speaks to you and you believe in their mission, I would join with them. If there isn't, then I would try to start something of your own, right? But with the lens, right, to the extent that you can, again, know that history, have that anti-racist lens, ensure that you're not perpetuating harms as part of that. But organizing is how we actually get anything done. There's only one way to, there's only two forms of power: organize money and organize people. And so if you don't have a lot of money, the only way that you're going to get an audience with, the only way you're going to build pressure on the powers that be and the decision makers is to come with people. And so again, joining something that is already out there, or organizing yourself amongst your neighbors, amongst your friends, is how to do that.
All right, great. So I'm going to start asking questions. We have a ton of questions. I'm going to ask people, all of you eloquent panelists, to just keep your answer to just a couple of minutes so we can get a bunch of questions. My first, and everybody's been fine so far, so don't take that as any kind of criticism, everyone. My first question is really about the time we're living in now, because I started this by talking about how obviously there's major injustice, and the hope is people organizing, being out in the streets, people speaking out. But what's so paradoxical about racial injustice, especially in the politics of white supremacy, is the way in which racial oppression can be utilized to precipitate more racial oppression. So right now, people are talking about a backlash. And of course, this idea of backlash is a fiction. There's never backlash. There's only anti-Black racism and white supremacy consistently, but there are spikes in there. So there's the Tulsa massacre, and there's Black people dying slowly every day. So what do you say about this idea of defund the police, and the idea that even Kenosha and the violence that we're seeing is going to produce a backlash? It's going to produce white fear. It's going to produce something that's going to impact the 2020 election in negative ways vis-a-vis justice and anti-racism. So each of you, I want you to go, and I'll start with you, Sukyi. And how do we prevent that? If that is happening right now, how do we forestall that?
Yeah, certainly there's, this system, our society and culture is pretty inflexible, but it's flexible in that, it adjusts when there's something that pushes against it. You know, it's really good at working its way around those things, those threats to it. But I think that I'm hopeful. You know, I just can't. I feel like there are so many eyes and hands trying to solve this problem right now, that I feel like it would be hard to quell that amount of um, anger, you know, that's caused for this uprising, and the just the fuel for that. But also, I think it's important to know that this didn't happen overnight. You know, activists in Austin and around the country have been defunding for years and years. It's just that things came to a head. You know, we're all sitting in our homes and we're all, you know, eyeballs are stuck to the screen all day, and you can't look away from these things, not like we used to be able to. We could just do something else. But I feel like we're all invested in this new way as well. But, you know, back in 2017, when AJC and our friend Chris and, you know, CCU and other groups worked on the police union contract, we managed to pull $40 million out of the police union contract. And someone was asking about how do we work on excessive force. And obviously we haven't solved that problem, but there was a very strong effort those years ago to pull millions and millions of dollars out of APD, because, you know, they're the highest paid police in the state, maybe the second now, but they're way up there. And, you know, we had the sense of quality promised but not delivered, you know, and their own data supports that. You know, the disproportionate policing of Black bodies is just off the charts. And so we were able to go during the time of the police union contract negotiations, where the contract is where discipline and accountability and oversight lives. It's not in the police policy manual, which is kind of a living document, and you can go and work on that anytime. On rare occasions, every 3 to 5 years, we're able to talk about discipline, oversight, accountability, and transparency. And that's when we went in on them for the first time. We did not use the term defund, but that is exactly what we were doing. But I think that it's also important to know that, like, we got to look back, see the successes from before, and recognize that the sky did not fall when we pulled $40 million out of the APD's budget. They were mad, and they threatened all kinds of things. They had similar rhetoric back then. You know, you don't trust the police. This was bad faith negotiating on part of the city, and the community hates police. And we just said, all we want is accountability, transparency, and oversight. These are things that will make sure that if you do something out on these streets, that you will receive discipline. You know, like, it was so easy to just go about your work, and it still kind of is, and it's still ongoing. But I just want to say that these conversations keep happening. It's bigger, it has more attention now, but there are things, language and tactics that we can look back and pull from. And I think that should make us feel less intimidated by this. It's just that more people have to learn how to do that. It's not just the three of us on this call. Thank goodness we are not the only ones anymore, because it's hard. And to feel seen and to know that our work has gotten us to this point, and that y'all are coming into it, that's what's refreshing. That's what's going to keep this going, is if you all learn where we were and what we can do together. I think that's how we continue to push on this. So someone also asked, you know, how they can get involved, and I mentioned that in September we're devoting AJC, our policy meetings, just to trainings, because it's just time. We need to train people on. The first one will be on relational organizing. How in the world do you talk on Facebook or to your family and friends about these things? and how do we make sure that those thoughts and ideas are getting out there? Because right now the misinformation is really strong out there, and we're trying to combat that. And our second training will be on legislative advocacy at the state level, because our next legislative session is in 2021. Every odd year in Texas, we have our legislative session, and we're training people up to speak to their representatives and to know how to navigate that entire crazy system that's a whole other beast in and of itself. But
All right, Sukyi, I'm going to stop you right there just so we can.
thank you for stopping me.
Kellee. Oh, you've got to unmute yourself, Kellee.
I was going to ask you if you could repeat the original.
Yeah, so I was saying, what can we do to stop this resistance, so-called backlash against defund, this idea of fear mongering? What can we do? And just really 2 minutes, we'll go around.
Okay, really 2 minutes.
Yes.
So I think that everyone there is a lot of fear, even for folks who will just benefit immediately from defunding or divestment investment. The way that I think we can sort of deal with that is really in building meaningful relationships and networks on the ground with the people who would benefit most from those changes. I don't know that it's really worthwhile to seek out folks who would be the white supremacist that shows up in the in the crowd and shoots right away, right? But there's I would rather spend my energy on folks who are ready and willing and wanting to do that work right now. But it's interesting because my son made me watch the Daryl Davis documentary thing last night, so we were having a back and forth about that. I think that I've never really looked to the federal government to fix it or free us, really, or politicians. Like, I don't know that that is gonna happen. With anything, any movement, any change, anywhere in the world, it always takes the people, right? Like Chris talked about power and building power. I think it's really about helping people understand that another way is possible by talking about and showing different times whenever we have had positive outcomes. There's folks like Nicole Burrows, who just left UT, who built out work in New York years ago with Paula and others, sister to sister, where, you know, they were doing work in a neighborhood where young women were being sexually harassed by cops, right? And they would go and they would hold them accountable in different ways and couldn't call the police, right? And so there's ways that we can practice that right now, that can quell some of that fear. I think having people participate in that.
Okay. Thank you.
That
Kellee.
enough?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, right there. Chris.
Sure. Well, we're a non-partisan C3 group, so I can't really comment directly on electoral issues, but I'll just say that I think the framing of that question is, the meaning of that question is, can the, organizers and advocates working to improve their communities just hold off until the next election, because hold off on improving your communities until this election cycle. One, there's no guarantees that any election is going to turn out any particular way on the basis of particularly what local organizers and advocates, especially whom the mainstream candidates have mostly, distanced themselves from, would have any role in the election. But also, I think it's, I would never tell people to stop trying to improve their communities, because I think it might, it could have some impact over here on this other thing, which may or may not improve our communities, and which, we don't really have any guarantee will improve our communities. So I think I would also just say, obviously, like, I think a lot of that's disingenuous in that, again, the mainstream candidates have largely distanced themselves from these efforts. And so if anyone is trying to associate any particular candidate with these movements, then that's a lie, because they're not necessarily a part of them or embracing them.
I have a question from one of our LBJ students about how can the university and academic researchers better include the Austin community, especially communities of color, in their research designs, to help transform just vulnerabilities that these populations face that are part of our community.
I think that question's from Raymond. What's up, Raymond? I know him well.
All right, 2 minutes, Kellee, because we're going to get
2 minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
I think one piece is really figuring out sort of where you're accountable, who you're accountable to, whether you're accountable to that community that you're researching. What is their role in that research? Will they benefit? If there's funding, how is that being allocated? Does that make sense? Are you just going to be sort of, they say parachuting in, right? What's the approach? Has the community helped to really develop the problem? Because sometimes we want to research things that maybe the community isn't down with. I think those are some of the basics. I don't know what others have to say.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. I think that community involvement in the makeup of whatever that tool is, and then if it's something like a survey, ensuring that goes out to the community. We did a survey on community perspectives on policing in the most policed communities in Austin. AJC did this a few years ago, and we were able to use those responses to inform our policy. So it enables you and advocacy groups to actually have the voices of the community members in all of our work, and to better inform the city, especially in places that can't get to City Hall or, call in or whatever it is. So it's a good way for you to bring in the community voice.
Yeah, I'll just echo those sentiments. I also would just say that I think there's a lot of inclination in academic circles and in some advocacy circles to really target everything towards quote unquote vulnerable communities. And I think, there's a lot of problems going on in Westlake. Go study them. If you're a part of that community, they got issues over there quite clearly. And so we just think about all the things that you're connected to and what makes sense for you to be actually looking into and researching.
Now, this is an interesting question, and I've asked it in a roundabout way, but very quickly, all three of you, and again, we're doing our lightning round. Does the term defund the police help or hurt the movement because people have to explain it, and it's just as a slogan? What do we think? Is it something that is helping or hurting? Is there other language that should better be used? Not because that language is anti-radical, but because the language is more illustrative of what activists actually mean by defunding the police.
That's a good question. It's also frustrating. It's like, shouldn't Black Lives Matter had thought of a different name? Because that movement has to do the exact same work, explaining what the hell Black Lives Matter means. Like, that needs explaining, really? But I mean, I hear you. Defund is more abstract than that. And maybe if I had to do it all over again, I would choose different wording, but I don't know, it's like, what wording are you the most comfortable with? Do you have the poll on that, So I don't know, I'm good with it. We're gonna roll with it and go with all the different definitions of it, and, see which one you fall on.
I'm aligned with that answer. I don't think that it's on the outside folks, well, not outside, but folks who are leading the work get to say what it is, right? Folks who are putting themselves out there get to call it what they want. I'm thinking about like the Black Power movement. I'm sure folks had issues with that, right?
Good.
Okay, so and had to explain that, but it still is a powerful statement, and it pushed the left, period. And I think that's the point of saying things like defund.
Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a question of what and who these terms need to ultimately appeal to in order to be successful, right? I think the defund the police slogan is explicitly a local efforts, right? It's explaining an effort that has to happen at the local level. In some communities, that's going to prove more popular than in others, but it doesn't need to appeal to the broad mass of the American population in order to be a useful term or successful term. I think that there's some confusion because for some advocates and activists, it's a tactic in order to create monies for reinvestment and other things. And for others, it's a long-term strategy as part of an actual abolition of police. And obviously, that divide is not necessarily going to be bridged or explained with a three-word slogan. But nonetheless, I think also a lot of the quote unquote confusion about the term is also disingenuous. I mean, people understood what defund Planned Parenthood meant. And so I don't understand why they would be confused about what defunding the police means.
Okay. We have a question. How can white allies help to make white neighborhoods and communities safer for people of color in spaces where they want to be in? And I think that question relates to also the idea that a lot of times predominantly white spaces that are of economic privilege, especially in Austin, they carry with them supply chains of power and privilege as opposed to misery and grief. That includes schools, that includes places that are the opposite of food deserts, resource rich. And at times when people of color are able to sneak into those places, they're able to navigate and get more access for their children and for themselves. Oftentimes they are not, they are out of luck because informally those places are segregated. And by informally, I mean there's no Jim Crow signs in these spaces, but it's hard to get into Hyde Park, into Tarrytown, into Westlake, really purposefully. We know that these are communities and how they were created. Hyde Park created as an all-white segregated, and I've got the advertising that says it's all white, come join us, right? Like the city of Vermont that said, come give us, we have ice cream and no black people, come to Burlington, Vermont. It was always the #1 city in the country, and I could never understand that because a native New Yorker with all the diversity in New York. So what can white allies do to make these spaces more welcoming for Black folks?
Yeah.
And people of color?
You're right. They do not have whites only signs, but they do have Nextdoor. If you were on the Nextdoor app, you know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
But I've seen in white spaces groups popping up. Circle C has an advocacy group that's very new, and they're talking about the things we're talking about and the way we're talking about them, and they are responding when they see someone who posts on things like Nextdoor about a Hispanic looking man in a car, who's probably Uber Eats or whatever. Same thing's happening in Hyde Park. I recently spoke with someone, and they're making moves here too. It's going to be a while because they have to find the people who are really willing to put themselves out there. But I sense that there are folks of privilege who are really starting to identify their privilege as a problem, but also as a tool. So they're balancing that.
Thank you.
This is purely from my personal opinion, but I would say if you are leading or organizing a space that is, white led, white financed, overwhelmingly white membership, and you want diversity into your group, then it's probably too late. What you really should be trying to do is to create spaces that are either co-led and co-financed, or to join spaces that are led and where the control and the finances are also led by people of color, and not try to Black people or brown people into the space that you've already set up and control.
Thank you.
Yeah. So my sense is basically that you brought up Westlake and Hyde Park, but the East Side is almost gone, right? There's still people here, but even that, I think that folks need to be checked about how that went down in the rapid gentrification and displacement of our communities, and how that land just became worth more because we pulled Black bodies off of it, right? I think that if you want to make space, or you want to be I want you to be a co-conspirator. I don't need an ally. I want you to be in the game with me, and be pushing as hard as you can for it. Say the things that I maybe can't say in the spaces that I can't say them. I also think that following the leadership of the people most directly impacted and being clear about that, about who's who and what's what, and not getting all the way caught up in social identity politics to where you get confused around who's right and who's real and who you need to be listening to. And doing that in a genuine way is different, because there's a whole lot of people out here right now who are like, defund the police, but are over here gentrifying our neighborhoods and taking advantage, land grabbing, all kinds of stuff, right? And always follow the money. Always follow the money, so that then we can all be clear about who's doing what and where people are at.
Man, Kelly's preaching like I feel like it's a great episode of The Wire, my favorite show of all time, where all the pieces matter. And
Lester.
Detective Lester Freeman always followed the money. Follow the money.
It's true.
This is my last question for our panel, Reimagining Public Safety, which is another slogan that we could push. Reimagine, 3 words, reimagining public safety, which includes, transforming policing. Hope. I want to talk about hope and leave us with that, because tomorrow is the March on Washington 57th anniversary. And like I alluded, there's a March on Washington 2020. We're expecting tens of thousands in Washington, D.C. And the first March on Washington, August 28th, 1963, was a March on Washington for jobs and freedom. It was an intersectional movement in terms of issues at the time, not in terms of people and identity like we have with BLM, which has been extraordinary, where we are talking about LGBTQIA. We're talking about people who are non-able-bodied. We're talking about people who are cash poor, the elder, people who are undocumented, and we're centering them and saying that we're not going to be free until all of us are free. So I find great hope in that. What is giving you hope right now in 2020? What is, with the work you're doing, with the advocacy, what is giving you hope as we even in the context of Kenosha, even in the context of Breonna Taylor and folks still not being charged, all these different things that we know we have to get done, but what is giving you hope? And I'll start with you, Sukyi.
Yeah, I do have a lot of hope. I mentioned before that I'm hopeful. I'm an optimist, but also a realist. I get that, the things that are possible are only possible because we show up and we do that work. And I'm hopeful because I know the people who show up and do that work. I know Kellee and I know Chris. Like, we could just stop there and I'm just done, but I'm hopeful because there are people who are not going anywhere, that are just committed mind, body, and soul to this work. And I'm just always grateful as well, like that, to be a part of that. And I'm grateful for other people who come into this work as well. And I just see that happening in mass. So that gives me great hope.
Thank you. Thank you, Sukyi. Chris, and then we'll close with Kellee.
Sure. I'm not gonna lie. It's a scary time right now in a lot of ways. So I don't want to pretend as though I'm overflowing with hope in this moment. But that said, I will say that I think you know, these protests, these uprisings around racial justice around the country, you know, I think some studies have said they might be the largest in the history of this country.
Yeah.
Give me a lot of hope that people are not only understanding intellectually the ongoing issues of racial injustice and police violence in our country, but that are actually willing to put their bodies on the line for it. And I, you know, and I have similar hope locally. You know, the council people that we've heard from say that they've never received more engagement about any topic, and some of the people that have been doing local work for a long time say they've never seen more engagement on any topic in the history of this town than over the calls for police divest, invest in the last few months. We're talking tens of thousands of people emailing, calling, hitting the streets. If that's not a cause for hope, I don't know what is.
Thank you, Chris. Kellee.
So for me, I think that how dare I not be hopeful from my ancestors? How dare I not be hopeful? I don't have no business not being hopeful. I couldn't. I mean, I think about who our people are, where we come from, everything that people have fought and died for and have built, you know, like there's so much joy too right now, that we can't let people steal that because it's changing. I think about it like childbirth, right? Because I'm a doula. I've done a lot of work around birth and birth justice. And I think about it as like the pain is for a purpose, right? Like you got to have a mantra. You got to understand that we're birthing something new, and we're hoping that, you know, we'll be able to build what we need. And there's so much work and labor, and people are here with us. And if we don't, this is life. If we have to have hope and enjoy it now, because whenever we move on, we need other folks to come with that same level of love and intensity, and you know, and move it forward, right? And keep going until we can get as far as we can.
Great, thank you, Kellee. Really, thank you so much. This whole panel, Sukyi McMahon from the Austin Justice Coalition, Kellee Coleman from the city's Equity Office, and Chris Harris of Texas Appleseed. All of them doing really. This is when people write the history of the civil rights movement, the people they should focus on, not just the big well-known icons, are the people who were doing the grassroots organizing. So people like Ella Baker, people like Fannie Lou Hamer, majority of them Black women, some Black men too, who are doing the day-to-day organizing. They're the people who were with poor people sleeping on the floors of shotgun shacks in Mississippi, Alabama, but also in Los Angeles, New York, also in Texas as well. And who really bled for democracy domestically, and not just overseas. So, you know, we've been very honored to have these three activists and organizers with us. I'll close all of this by thanking everyone for joining us on this webinar. We have a whole lot of work to do as a city. The University of Texas has a whole lot of work to do.
Bring your hands to your third eye center.
I don't know what that is. Oh, my yoga stuff is suddenly out. Yeah, that's a little blip. This is I do practice yoga, and the yoga iPad just kind of came on right there. But we at the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, we don't think that voting rights, that public safety is a partisan issue. Human rights, civil rights is not a partisan issue, and neither is Black Lives Matter, even though we're aware that this country, we've turned these into partisan issues. Right now, we should all feel very, very hopeful, even as we feel a lot of loss and pain over all the violence and death that is surrounding us, including right here in Austin with the death of Mike Ramos and others who sometimes they don't get listed in the national roll call of people who've been killed by the police, but they are part of that nonetheless. So all of us here, as we commemorate tomorrow, the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington, One of the words that Dr. King said that day, that Wednesday afternoon in 1963, he begins his speech by saying, now is the time to make real the promise of democracy. And so what we're seeing out in the streets right now, what we're seeing with all the protests and the organizing, is people who really believe in small d democracy, who believe in justice and human rights for all people, and who really believe that none of us are free until all of us are free. So I thank you and welcome you into this space for people who haven't been part of this space. If people want to get in touch with any of the panelists, they can go to our website, www.csrd.lbj.edu. We'll have their information there. There's so much good work being done around not just anti-racism, but racial justice, social justice, equity here in Austin. And Austin is scheduled to create the most wealth in the next 2 decades of any American city. And unless we make that an equitable distribution of that wealth, we are not going to be the city that we aspire to be, right? So thank you. Everyone should do your service-oriented leadership work for tomorrow. Tomorrow is a very, very important day, not only March on Washington 2020, but 1963. And like Kellee said, we are standing on the shoulders of those ancestors, some still alive, who marched for us and organized for us and fought for us and died for us to try to achieve a different country. Thank you.